The sun was shining brightly over the suburban streets. The neighborhood looked perfect, almost like a picture in a magazine. Every house had a neatly trimmed lawn, and the sidewalks were clean. Birds chirped, kids played on their bikes, and people walked their dogs with smiles on their faces. On the surface, it looked like an ordinary, peaceful community. But behind the smiles, there was a storm brewing. One that no one saw coming. At the center of this storm was a woman everyone quietly called HOA Karen. She was the kind of person who believed rules were more important than people. She carried herself with an air of authority that made some neighbors nervous and others resentful. Her voice had a sharp edge, and her eyes seemed to look for mistakes wherever she went. HOA Karen had been leading the Homeowners Association for years, and she took her role very seriously. Too seriously, in fact. Every little imperfection in the neighborhood became her personal mission to fix. A mailbox that leaned slightly, a garden gnome that was too tall, a car parked in the wrong spot. Nothing escaped her notice. The protagonist, who lived in one of the larger houses on the corner, had a quiet life. They enjoyed gardening, reading, and taking long walks. They liked the peace and simplicity of the neighborhood and usually avoided conflicts. But HOA Karen's constant scrutiny made life stressful. Letters started arriving at the front door almost every week. Each one was more demanding than the last. There were warnings about lawn heights, flower colors, and even the type of mulch used in the garden. Some letters included threats of fines or legal action. Neighbors whispered about how strict she had become, but few dared to confront her. Most people just complied, hoping to stay on her good side. One morning, the protagonist received yet another letter. They had learned to expect it, but this one made their jaw tighten. HOA Karen had written in bold, sharp handwriting, the backyard fence was the wrong color, and it must be repainted within 10 days. Failure to comply would result in a hefty fine. The protagonist read it calmly, but inside, frustration bubbled. This was not the first time HOA Karen had overstepped, and it would not be the last. Instead of reacting impulsively, they put the letter down and took a deep breath. They knew they had options, but they needed to approach this carefully. Across the street, a group of neighbors gathered by the mailbox. They talked quietly, sharing stories of HOA Karen's latest demands. One neighbor mentioned that she had fined a family for having a small inflatable pool in their yard. Another said she had sent a letter threatening to tow a car that was parked just a few inches past the curb. Everyone nodded in agreement, some with amusement, some with concern. The protagonist listened from their porch, watching the scene with interest. They knew that HOA Karen thrived on fear and control. She had built her image on making everyone feel like she had power, and she had been very successful at it. Despite the tension, life in the neighborhood continued. Children played, and neighbors exchanged greetings. But behind the surface, the protagonist observed a pattern. HOA Karen's power came from perception, not reality. She believed she could dictate every small detail, but she did not understand the bigger picture. This realization gave the protagonist a sense of calm. They decided to respond not with anger, but with strategy. The next day, protagonists went about their routine, watering the garden and trimming the hedges. They watched HOA Karen walk down the street, clipboard in hand, inspecting each house. She stopped at one neighbor's driveway and frowned at the angle of a parked car. She muttered something under her breath and moved on. The protagonist smiled quietly. They had seen this before. HOA Karen loved to believe that she was in control, but in truth, she had no idea who she was dealing with. In the evenings, the protagonist reflected on the situation. They thought about how HOA Karen had treated others and the stress she caused. But they also realized that confrontation had to be handled wisely. They could not simply ignore her, nor could they respond impulsively. They needed a plan that would show that power and authority were not always what they seemed. The key was patience, observation, and timing. They knew that every action HOA Karen took could be used to reveal the truth when the moment was right. Neighbors began to notice subtle changes in the protagonist's demeanor. There was a quiet confidence that was different from before. While HOA Karen continued her rounds, the protagonist remained composed, almost as if they knew something everyone else did not. Rumors began to spread about how the protagonist handled the letters and fines. Some neighbors admired their calm approach, while others were curious about what they were planning. HOA Karen, of course, remained oblivious to these thoughts. She believed that intimidation and strict rules were enough to maintain control. One afternoon, HOA Karen decided to visit the protagonist in person. She knocked on the door with a sense of triumph, ready to enforce her latest demand. The protagonist opened the door, greeting her with a polite smile. HOA Karen began reciting the violations and fines, expecting to see fear or anxiety. Instead, the protagonist listened calmly, nodding occasionally. When she finished, the protagonist responded with a calm, measured voice, asking for clarification on specific clauses and legal references. HOA Karen was taken aback. She had expected resistance, maybe even anger, but not this level of composure. For the first time, she felt a flicker of uncertainty. The conversation continued, with HOA Karen growing increasingly frustrated. She emphasized rules and authority, but the protagonist asked questions that highlighted inconsistencies and overreach. HOA Karen left the house feeling uneasy, though she tried to maintain her confidence in front of neighbors. Behind the scenes, doubts began to creep in. This was unusual, and she did not like it. She had always been able to maintain control by keeping people off balance. But the protagonist was different. That evening, the protagonist reflected on the day's events. They knew that HOA Karen would try again, but now they also knew that she could be handled. Patience and strategy were key. They began gathering documents, reviewing property records, and understanding the legal framework of the county. Every detail mattered. Every piece of information could be used to reveal the truth at the right time. The protagonist understood that true power was not about intimidation or rules. It was about knowledge, preparation, and timing. Days passed, and HOA Karen continued her usual rounds. She issued more letters and tried to assert authority, but the protagonist remained calm. They responded methodically, always within the rules, always polite, always composed. Neighbors began to notice that the protagonist was not easily swayed or intimidated. A quiet sense of respect started to form. People whispered about how the protagonist handled each situation with grace and confidence. Despite the tension, the protagonist did not lose sight of life's simple pleasures. They continued to enjoy gardening, reading, and walks. They smiled at neighbors, engaged in light conversations, and maintained a sense of normalcy. This balance made them appear even stronger. HOA Karen, on the other hand, seemed more agitated with each passing day. Her attempts to control the neighborhood were less effective, and she began to feel the first real cracks in her perceived power. The protagonist also began to notice patterns in HOA Karen's behavior. She thrived on attention and conflict. She loved to see others react to her demands. By remaining calm and composed, the protagonist was slowly undermining her. It was not done with malice, but with clarity and intelligence. Each interaction with HOA Karen became an opportunity to observe, learn, and prepare for the moment when the truth could be revealed. Neighbors continued to watch the silent battle unfold. Some were amused, some supportive, and some cautious. They saw the protagonist handle each encounter with patience and strategy, never losing composure. The quiet confidence and careful planning began to shift the perception of power in the neighborhood. People realized that authority is not always about rules or titles. Sometimes it is about knowing when to act and when to wait. By the end of part 1, the stage was set. The protagonist had established a calm and confident presence in the neighborhood. HOA Karen continued her attempts to assert authority, unaware that the balance of power was slowly shifting. Neighbors watched with curiosity and anticipation. The protagonist understood that patience, knowledge, and timing would be their greatest allies in the days to come. The real story, the real confrontation, was only beginning. And when the moment came, it would be a revelation that no one, not even HOA Karen, could ignore as the days went by. The tension in the neighborhood continued to grow. HOA Karen was more active than ever. She spent hours inspecting lawns, porches, and driveways. She seemed determined to find new reasons to send letters or issue fines. Nothing escaped her notice, from a slightly crooked welcome mat to a flower that grew taller than she thought was proper. The neighbors were both amused and frustrated. Some whispered behind her back, while others nodded nervously when she passed. Everyone felt the weight of her scrutiny. The protagonist, however, remained steady. They continued to respond calmly to every letter and demand. They did not yell or argue. Instead, they read each notice carefully and responded in writing, politely requesting clarifications or referencing relevant rules and regulations. Each response was professional and precise. And this confused HOA Karen. She had expected resistance, maybe panic or frustration, but not this level of composure. The protagonist was methodical. It became clear to some neighbors that she might be losing control. HOA. Karen's next move was to make a public example of the protagonist. She called for a meeting at the community center, inviting all the neighbors to attend. The notice was full of warnings, listing all the alleged violations and demanding that the protagonist explain themselves. It was a long list of small things, like a slightly uneven fence or a few flowers in the wrong spot. The neighbors whispered as they read the notice. Some found it ridiculous. Others felt nervous about being associated with such a strict authority. On the day of the meeting, the community center was full. HOA Karen walked in with a clipboard, her eyes scanning the room, seeking validation and fear. She began to speak in her usual tone, emphasizing her power and authority. She explained the rules, the fines, and the potential consequences for not complying. Some neighbors nodded out of habit, while others shifted uncomfortably in their seats. The protagonist listened quietly, making notes and maintaining a calm expression. They did not interrupt, but every now and then, their eyes met HOA Karen's, steady and unshaken. As HOA Karen continued, she grew more confident. She pointed at the protagonist, accusing them of disregarding the rules and disrespecting the community. She expected a flustered response, but the protagonist remained calm. They waited until she finished her long explanation. Then, with a gentle, polite voice, they asked specific questions. They asked for the legal basis of certain rules and why fines were issued for minor infractions. They questioned the consistency of the policies and pointed out contradictions that had been overlooked. HOA Karen was visibly irritated. She had not expected this. She tried to interrupt, but the protagonist kept speaking with measured confidence. The neighbors began to murmur among themselves. Some whispered, surprised at the calm intelligence of the protagonist. They realized that HOA Karen had always relied on fear and authority, not on knowledge or logic. The protagonist's questions highlighted the inconsistencies in her actions. The room felt different now, tense but shifting. The sense of absolute power that HOA Karen had maintained for years was cracking. It's just slightly, but enough to make her uneasy. After the meeting, HOA Karen stormed out, frustrated and flustered. She muttered under her breath, trying to convince herself that she had still won. But the neighbors saw the change in her demeanor. She had been challenged, not with anger or confrontation, but with calm reasoning. The protagonist had shown that authority was not the same as power. True power was not about intimidation. It was about understanding, preparation, and timing. The next few days were filled with small skirmishes. HOA Karen tried to reassert control with letters, phone calls, and visits. She demanded explanations, corrections, and compliance. Each time the protagonist responded with calm clarity. They never raised their voice, never threatened, and never allowed frustration to take over. Every response was carefully written, polite, and based on facts. Slowly, the neighbors began to notice a pattern. HOA Karen's authority was no longer absolute. The protagonist handled each situation without anger, showing that control could be managed differently. Meanwhile, the protagonist took small steps to prepare for a larger revelation. They quietly gathered documents and reviewed property records. Learning more about the legal and financial framework of the county, they understood that knowledge was their greatest tool. While HOA Karen focused on small rules and minor violations, the protagonist focused on the bigger picture. They knew that the right moment to reveal the truth would come, and when it did, it would be undeniable. The protagonist also observed HOA Karen carefully. They noticed how she reacted to challenges, how her confidence wavered when she was questioned, and how she relied on fear to maintain her position. This knowledge was important. The protagonist did not seek to humiliate her unnecessarily, but understood that exposing the illusion of her power was essential. They waited patiently, letting her continue her overreach while they prepared a strategic response. In the neighborhood, conversations began to change. Some neighbors were inspired by the protagonist's calm approach. They discussed how it was possible to face conflict without fear or anger. Others were simply curious, watching closely to see what would happen next. The protagonist became a quiet figure of respect and intrigue. Their actions were deliberate, measured, and intelligent. HOA Karen's usual dominance seemed weaker with each interaction. One afternoon, HOA Karen decided to visit the protagonist at home again. She was determined to enforce her rules and show that she was still in charge. She knocked on the door, expecting tension or panic. The protagonist opened the door with a welcoming smile. HOA Karen launched into a list of demands and fines, pointing at various alleged violations. But the protagonist remained calm, asking questions, clarifying rules, and pointing out inconsistencies. HOA Karen grew frustrated. She had never faced someone who could challenge her without anger or fear. As the conversation continued, HOA Karen's irritation became visible. She attempted to assert authority with louder voice and sharper tones, but the protagonist's calm demeanor never wavered. They responded with clarity and logic, showing that her attempts at intimidation were ineffective. Neighbors walking by began to notice the tension. Some smiled quietly, appreciating the protagonist's composed approach. Others whispered about how unusual it was to see someone remain so confident under pressure that evening. The protagonist reflected on the day's events. They understood that HOA Karen thrived on conflict, on seeing others react emotionally. By remaining calm and strategic, they were slowly shifting the balance of power. Each encounter was an opportunity to observe, learn, and prepare. They were not seeking immediate victory, but patiently waiting for the right moment to reveal the bigger truth. They knew that when the time came, it would be undeniable. Over the next few weeks, HOA Karen continued her relentless efforts. She issued more letters and inspections, hoping to regain control. The protagonist continued to respond with patience and intelligence. Each response highlighted the limitations of her authority. Neighbors noticed the pattern. They began to see that true power was not about fear or control, but about understanding and preparation. The protagonist became a figure of quiet strength, someone who could face challenges without losing composure. Despite the ongoing tension, life in the neighborhood continued. Children played, neighbors chatted, and everyday routines went on. The protagonist maintained this balance, showing that it was possible to handle conflict without letting it dominate life. HOA Karen, meanwhile, became increasingly frustrated. She had always relied on fear and intimidation, and she was discovering that it was not enough. By the end of Part 2, the scene was set for a confrontation that would reveal the true nature of authority and power. HOA Karen continued to believe she was in charge, but the neighborhood had begun to see a different story. The protagonist's calm, intelligent approach had exposed cracks in her perceived power. The stage was ready for the next chapter, where strategy, preparation, and timing would play a crucial role in the ultimate reveal. The days after the last meeting were quieter, but the tension in the neighborhood remained. HOA Karen had not given up. She continued her rounds with clipboard in hand, checking fences, lawns, and sidewalks. Every small imperfection became a target for her letters and warnings. She seemed determined to prove that she still had control. But the protagonist remained calm, responding to each challenge with patience and intelligence. The protagonist spent time carefully reviewing property documents and county records. They wanted to understand everything about the rules, the land, and the legal framework that governed the neighborhood. It was not about confrontation yet, but about preparation. They knew that knowledge would be their most powerful tool. Each piece of information added to their understanding of the situation and gave them confidence that the right moment for action would come. Neighbors noticed the protagonist, moving with quiet purpose. They saw someone who was calm, confident, and careful in every step. Unlike HOA Karen, who acted impulsively and relied on fear, the protagonist acted with thought and foresight. Some neighbors began to quietly admire the way the protagonist handled each encounter. They watched as letters were answered promptly, as questions were asked politely but firmly, and as minor conflicts were resolved without drama. There was a sense of respect building quietly among the residents. HOA Karen, however, was unaware of what was happening behind the scenes. She believed her authority remained unchallenged. She continued to issue letters and fines, expecting compliance. Each visit to the protagonist's house was met with calm questions and polite responses. She was growing increasingly frustrated but did not understand why her usual tactics were failing. The protagonist had learned to use her overconfidence against her, letting her reveal her weaknesses through her own words and actions. One afternoon, the protagonist decided to take a walk around the neighborhood to observe. They noticed subtle reactions from neighbors as HOA Karen passed by. Some looked uneasy, others whispered quietly, and a few smiled knowingly. It was clear that the perception of power was shifting. People were beginning to realize that HOA Karen's dominance was not absolute. The protagonist did not seek attention or recognition, but their careful, composed behavior was having an effect. During their walk, the protagonist stopped at the community park and observed families enjoying their afternoon. Children ran and played, parents chatted on benches, and the neighborhood seemed peaceful. Yet beneath this calm, the struggle for authority was ongoing. HOA Karen had convinced herself that she controlled the neighborhood, but in truth she was only controlling fear. The protagonist understood that the real power was different. It came from knowledge, patience, and timing. Back at home, the protagonist continued to prepare. They organized documents, reviewed legal records, and consulted with professionals in a quiet, careful way. Each step was deliberate. They were not acting out of anger or frustration. They were planning a strategy. This was about showing the truth at the right moment, not about reacting impulsively. Every letter from HOA Karen, every fine or threat, was being noted and added to a collection of evidence. The protagonist knew that when the moment came, the impact would be undeniable. The protagonist also began to reach out subtly to neighbors, not to boast, but to gently guide and inform. They shared advice on responding to letters and explained minor legal points. This helped others feel more confident and less fearful of HOA Karen's overreach. Slowly, a sense of quiet solidarity began to build in the community. People started to see that compliance was not the only option, and that calm, knowledge-based responses could shift the balance of power. HOA Karen continued to escalate her tactics. She organized another community meeting, intending to assert her authority and show that she was still in charge. The notice was long and intimidating, listing every perceived violation and warning of consequences. The neighbors read it with mixed feelings, some worried, some amused, and some curious about what would happen next. The protagonist remained calm, seeing this as an opportunity to observe and prepare. At the meeting, HOA Karen began her usual routine, speaking loudly and confidently, pointing out violations and demanding explanations. The protagonist listened, quietly taking notes and asking precise questions at appropriate moments. They asked for clarification on the rules, questioned inconsistencies, and highlighted areas where authority had been overstepped. HOA Karen tried to respond with sharp words, but the protagonist remained composed, answering calmly and logically. The room felt different this time. The neighbors were starting to realize that authority could be questioned without conflict. The meeting ended with HOA Karen leaving in frustration, feeling her authority challenged but unable to identify why she was losing control. The neighbors left with new perspectives. Some were inspired by the protagonist's calm approach. Others were curious about what would happen next. The balance of power was shifting, even if HOA Karen could not yet see it, in the days that followed. The protagonists continued their quiet preparation. They reviewed county property records, checked ownership documents, and familiarized themselves with the legal framework of the area. They wanted to ensure that when the moment came to reveal the truth, there would be no doubt or dispute. Every interaction with HOA Karen was an opportunity to observe her behavior and gather evidence. The protagonist was patient. Understanding that timing was crucial, neighbors began to quietly support the protagonist, offering small gestures of encouragement and expressing relief that someone was calmly addressing HOA Karen's overreach. They appreciated the intelligence, patience, and fairness displayed. Slowly, the protagonist became a figure of quiet respect and confidence, someone who represented rationality and knowledge over fear and intimidation. HOA Karen, unaware of the growing influence of the protagonist, continued to attempt to assert control. She issued more letters, conducted inspections, and tried to intimidate neighbors. Each time, the protagonist responded with calm clarity. Her questions, requests for clarification, references to rules, highlighted the inconsistencies and limitations of her authority. HOA Karen became more agitated with each encounter, unable to understand why her usual methods were ineffective. One afternoon, HOA Karen visited the protagonist at home again, determined to enforce her latest demands. She began listing violations and threatening fines, expecting a flustered response. The protagonist listened carefully, asked precise questions, and calmly pointed out contradictions. HOA Karen's confidence faltered as she struggled to maintain her usual authority. The neighbors passing by noticed the tension and whispered among themselves, observing how the protagonist managed the situation with patience and intelligence. That evening, the protagonist reflected on the events of the day. They knew that HOA Karen thrived on conflict and fear. By remaining calm, knowledgeable, and prepared, they were slowly undermining her perceived power. Every encounter was a chance to learn, plan, and strengthen their position. They were not seeking revenge, only the right moment to reveal the truth. A moment that would change the dynamics of the neighborhood forever. Life continued in the neighborhood. Children played, neighbors chatted, and everyday routines went on. Yet, beneath this normalcy, the protagonist was preparing for a moment that would reveal the true nature of authority. HOA Karen believed she was still in control, but the quiet confidence, preparation, and knowledge of the protagonist were shifting the balance. The stage was set for the next chapter, where strategy, patience, and timing would lead to a revelation that no one could ignore. Part 3 ended with anticipation, as the protagonist quietly and steadily prepared to show the neighborhood and HOA Karen what true power really meant. The day of the big HOA meeting arrived, and the community center was buzzing with energy. Neighbors filled the chairs, some curious, some anxious, and some quietly excited. Everyone had heard rumors about the protagonist's calm handling of HOA Karen's relentless demands. The tension in the air was thick, as if something important was about to happen. HOA Karen arrived with her usual confidence, clipboard in hand. Ready to assert her authority and prove that she was in control, she began her usual routine. Standing tall and speaking loudly, she outlined every violation, every fine, and every demand she had made in recent weeks. She pointed at the protagonist, expecting to see fear or frustration. Instead, the protagonist sat quietly, observing, calm, and ready. Their composure was striking, and it seemed to unsettle HOA Karen. She tried to continue with her speech, but the atmosphere in the room was different this time. Neighbors were watching closely, waiting for the next move. The protagonist finally stood and spoke, their voice calm and measured. They asked HOA Karen for specific legal references to each violation and explained inconsistencies they had noted in previous letters and fines. HOA Karen attempted to interrupt, but the protagonist held their ground politely. With every word, they drew attention to the gaps in her authority. Neighbors began to whisper, noticing that HOA Karen's confident demeanor was cracking. Then, the protagonist reached for a folder and placed it on the table. They opened it and began showing documents that clearly demonstrated ownership and authority over the entire county, including the neighborhood. The room fell silent. Neighbors leaned in, eyes wide as they read the documents. HOA Karen's mouth opened, then closed, as shock replaced her usual confidence. The power she had assumed she wielded so easily suddenly seemed fragile and insignificant. The protagonist spoke calmly, explaining that the documents proved ownership and ultimate authority. HOA Karen's position as the leader of the HOA while seemingly powerful, was meaningless in the face of actual authority. The room was quiet except for the occasional gasp. Neighbors looked at each other, realizing the gravity of the revelation. HOA Karen was no longer the center of power. She had overestimated her influence, and now it was clear to everyone. HOA Karen tried to respond, stammering and gesturing, but the protagonist continued without interruption. They emphasized that future decisions by the HOA would need to comply with the legal ownership and guidelines they had provided. Any attempt to enforce fines or rules without following proper authority would be null and void. The calm confidence of the protagonist contrasted sharply with HOA Karen's growing panic and frustration. Neighbors began to whisper in excitement. Some smiled quietly, others laughed softly at the irony of the situation. For years they had felt intimidated by HOA Karen, but now they saw that her power had been an illusion. The protagonist's strategic patience, knowledge, and calm had revealed the truth. HOA Karen's attempts at authority crumbled before the evidence and the composure of the protagonist. The protagonist then addressed the neighbors, explaining the importance of understanding true authority and power. They emphasized that respect must come from knowledge, fairness, and transparency, not fear or intimidation. The room listened intently. The atmosphere shifted from tension to understanding. Neighbors felt a sense of relief and newfound clarity. They could see the difference between perceived power and actual power. And the protagonist had made that lesson clear without anger or conflict. HOA Karen's frustration reached a peak. She tried to assert herself again, but it was too late. The room no longer responded to her threats or gestures. Her confidence had evaporated. She realized that the protagonist had not only prepared meticulously, but had also anticipated every move she could make. Her sense of authority was gone, replaced by a recognition that she had overreached and underestimated the situation. After the meeting, neighbors lingered to discuss the events. They congratulated the protagonist quietly, expressing admiration for the way the situation had been handled. The community began to feel a shift in morale. People realized that patience, knowledge, and calmness could counter fear and intimidation. The protagonist had not only revealed the truth, but also set an example for how to handle conflicts and authority with intelligence and grace. HOA Karen left the meeting in a state of disbelief. She had expected to control the narrative, to intimidate and assert authority. Instead, she had been exposed. Her perception of power was shattered, and the realization was difficult to accept. Neighbors watched as she walked away, noting the change in her demeanor. The protagonist's calm and prepared approach had changed the dynamic forever in the days that followed. The neighborhood settled into a new rhythm. HOA Karen no longer tried to assert unnecessary authority. The protagonist continued to be approachable, guiding neighbors and answering questions. The community felt safer, freer, and more respectful. The balance of power had shifted in a way that was visible and tangible. People realized that authority is not about titles or threats. It is about knowledge, patience, strategic action. The protagonist also took time to review the events and lessons learned. They knew that true authority comes from preparation, calmness, and understanding. By remaining composed and strategic, they had not only protected themselves but also empowered the community. The neighbors now had a role model in the protagonist, someone who handled challenges with dignity and intelligence. Life continued in the neighborhood. Children played, families enjoyed their yards, and people greeted each other with smiles. The atmosphere was lighter, freer, and more relaxed. HOA Karen no longer wielded fear as a tool, and the community benefited from the shift. The protagonist had changed the neighborhood in a subtle but profound way. They had demonstrated that knowledge, patience, calm action are more powerful than intimidation. By the end of Part 4, the stage was set for a lasting resolution. HOA Karen had been humbled, the neighbors had been enlightened, and the protagonist had shown the true nature of power. The community had learned a valuable lesson about authority, respect, and patience. The protagonist's careful planning and strategic reveal had created a turning point that would not be forgotten. The story was moving toward its conclusion with a sense of satisfaction, justice, and clarity that only comes from careful observation, preparation, and calm action. The days following the big HOA meeting were calm in a way the neighborhood had not felt for years. The tension that had existed under HOA Corin's strict oversight began to dissolve. People walked with a little more ease, children played a little more freely, and conversations between neighbors were lighter and friendlier. The protagonists continued to go about daily life with the same quiet confidence and patience that had defined their approach from the very beginning. HOA Karen, meanwhile, had withdrawn. Her attempts at authority had been exposed as empty, and she no longer had the same influence over the neighborhood. She still appeared now and then, checking on minor issues, but her gestures and warnings no longer carried weight. The community had seen the difference between her perception of power and true authority, and the protagonist's strategic and composed approach had set a clear example of how to handle challenges with intelligence rather than fear. Neighbors began to approach the protagonist more openly, expressing admiration and gratitude. Some had previously felt powerless, intimidated by HOA Karen's overreach. Now they saw that knowledge, patience, and calm reasoning could be more effective than compliance through fear. People asked questions about the documents shown at the meeting and sought advice on how to handle future HOA communications. The protagonist responded with patience, guiding them and explaining things in simple, understandable terms. This created a sense of trust and community that had been lacking before in the following weeks. The protagonists continued to maintain this atmosphere. They monitored the HOA's actions, but did so quietly, never resorting to anger or confrontation. They were fair and reasonable in all interactions, showing that authority can be exercised responsibly. Neighbors began to model this behavior, addressing minor issues calmly and rationally. The change was subtle, but powerful. The community was no longer ruled by fear, but by understanding, respect, and shared knowledge. HOA Karen tried a few times to regain influence. She sent letters and attempted to enforce rules. But the response from the protagonist was calm and methodical, pointing out legal and procedural limitations. Her attempts were met with polite but firm corrections, and the community no longer reacted with fear or compliance. It was clear that her role had diminished, and she had to accept that her perceived power had limits. The protagonist had shown that true authority is grounded in preparation, intelligence, and patience, not intimidation. The neighborhood began to enjoy a new sense of freedom. Families painted fences and planted gardens without fear of unnecessary fines. Children played outside more often, and community events became more relaxed and friendly. The protagonist's example had created a ripple effect, influencing how others approached authority and conflict. People learned to communicate clearly, check facts, and handle disagreements calmly. The environment had shifted from one of tension to one of mutual respect. The protagonist also reflected on the journey that had brought them here. They remembered the first letters, the inspections, and the initial attempts at intimidation. They understood that patience, observation, and careful preparation had been key. By responding calmly and gathering knowledge, they had not only defended themselves, but also helped the neighborhood see the true nature of power. It was a victory not won through confrontation, but through strategy and understanding. As time passed, HOA Karen faded further into the background. She no longer held the same presence or authority, and her influence became minimal. Neighbors stopped worrying about her actions and instead focused on building a stronger, more cooperative community. The protagonist continued to be a quiet presence, offering guidance and advice when needed, but never asserting dominance unnecessarily. Their leadership was based on respect, knowledge, and fairness. And this approach strengthened the bonds within the HOA. The transformation of the community was evident in small but meaningful ways. Neighbors helped each other with yard work and repairs, shared tools and resources, and supported one another in daily life. Children played together across yards. Parents spoke more openly. And the sense of fear that had once permeated the streets had disappeared. The protagonist had created an environment where cooperation and understanding thrived. people learned that authority does not need to be feared, but can be respected when exercised responsibly. The protagonists continued to monitor the neighborhood with quiet diligence. They ensured that rules and regulations were followed reasonably, that conflicts were addressed calmly, and that the community remained a place of respect and fairness. Their actions were subtle and unassuming, yet the impact was profound. HOA Karen's overreach had been neutralized, and the neighborhood had regained a sense of harmony and autonomy. Neighbors often shared stories of the events leading up to the reveal, talking about the calm, strategic approach of the protagonist and how it had exposed the limits of HOA Karen's authority. These stories became part of the community's collective memory, serving as a reminder that true power comes from knowledge, patience, and thoughtful action. The protagonist's actions were celebrated not for ego or dominance, but for the positive change they brought to the neighborhood. Over time, HOA Karen ceased to be a significant factor in the neighborhood. She occasionally attended meetings, but her presence no longer carried the weight it once did. The community had learned to see through fear-based authority and to value reason, preparation, and patience. The protagonist continued to guide and support the neighborhood, maintaining calm and fairness in all interactions. The balance of power had shifted permanently. The community flourished as a result. The protagonist's approach had also inspired subtle changes in the wider neighborhood culture. People began to communicate more effectively, address disputes calmly, and consider the bigger picture before acting. The lessons learned from HOA Karen's overreach and the protagonist's response were remembered and applied in daily life. Neighbors felt empowered, confident, and united. The community had transformed from one dominated by fear to one guided by understanding and respect. In the end, the neighborhood thrived under the protagonist's quiet but effective leadership. HOA Karen's attempts at control had been revealed as overreach, and the community had gained a deeper understanding of authority, power, and respect. The protagonist had shown that patience, knowledge, and calm, strategic action could achieve results far greater than intimidation or fear. The story concluded with a neighborhood that was more connected, confident, and harmonious than ever before. A testament to the power of careful planning, thoughtful action, and the courage to remain calm in the face of overbearing authority.